everyone, welcome to video 3 for the Sunflower Shopping Tote. In this video we're going to be making our handles and our O-ring connectors, and at the end we're also going to baste our piping to our main panels. If you're not using piping, you can skip the last part of the video, but I'll do this at the very end. So what you'll need for this video is your two main panels, and you'll need your two shoulder strap pieces, and then you'll need your 4 sets of mirror image O-ring connector pieces and your 4 O-rings. Now I'm going to set aside, keep this all together. I'm going to set this aside for now, and all we need to start are our shoulder strap pieces. And I'll show you what we're going to do first with this first piece, and then you can repeat all the same steps with the second piece. So what we'll do first is, on the wrong side of our shoulder strap piece, we're going to draw a line down the center. So because these are 3 inches wide, we're drawing a line at 1.5 inch from each of the longer edges. And my pen is not working. This seems to be a theme in this video series, things not working. Okay, and of course you'll repeat all of these steps for the second shoulder strap. I'm not going to show you how to do both of them, you just repeat the same sequence of steps. Okay, now I'm going to set that aside, and what we're going to do is take 2 of our 1.5 inch O-rings, and we're going to pass 2 of them, pass the strap piece through 2 of them. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you're going to take the 2 shorter ends and you're going to line them up together like this, right sides together. Make sure that your strap piece isn't twisted. You want it to be right sides together the entire way. And then I'm just going to clip these together. Now if you're using a really thick vinyl, normally I would have you sew these pieces together on a diagonal 45-degree angle here. And you would actually place them differently. You would have them like this, and you would sew diagonally from this corner to this corner. But this cork isn't really very thick, and my machine handles layers pretty well, so I'm just going to do a straight seam this time. And I'll go over to my machine, and I'm going to sew these together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I will open up that seam allowance, and I'm going to top stitch on either side of the seam. So I'll go ahead and do that now, and then I'll show you the next step. Okay, so I've sewn the 2 shorter ends of the strap piece together, and then I opened my seam allowance and I top stitched on either side of the seam. I thought it would be best to show you this next part in front of the machine. What we're going to do is we're going to fold over, wrong sides together, each half of the strap in towards the center line that we drew. So you want this outer edge to meet the center line, and then we're going to fold and sew at the same time. Now I'm not sure how much thread I have in my bobbin, so I'm playing a little game of bobbin roulette here. Okay, so now I've folded in towards the center, and I'm just going to sew with, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the center line. And I keep my needle in the down position just so that my strap doesn't move around and I'm doing a nice straight line. So you just keep going until you've completed the entire loop, and then you do the same thing for the second side. So I usually start always where I've sewn the pieces together, and you'll just turn the strap around and then you'll start sewing the other side. Same thing, you're folding towards the center and then you're sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance from that center line. And then when you're done this part, you should have a giant loop. So I'll finish sewing the strap and then I'll show you what our strap loop looks like. I've completed sewing the strap loop. I'm going to show you what it looks like. You'll see here that if I fold it, you can see the raw edges at the center, and this is now the wrong side of the strap, and you should have your 2 O-rings attached to this loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to flatten the loop and push we're going to push the O-rings to either end. So I have my seam here. You can put it wherever you like along the length of the handles. I tend to either put it in the middle or I put it as close to one of the O-rings as possible, just so that it's sort of not as obvious. I don't want to hide it necessarily, I just want to make it less obvious. So you're flattening the loop, you have your O-rings at either end of the strap piece, and the raw edges that you folded towards the center, those should be hidden inside the layers of the strap loop now. And all you do is flatten and add some clips along the entire length. And then what I do too is when you're sewing the strap layers together, they tend to flatten a little bit, and I just want to make sure that the edges meet nicely. You don't want one of the layers to be farther out than the bottom layer. Okay. So once you're done adding clips along both edges, then you're going to go back to your machine and you're going to sew the loop closed. And the way that you do that is you're basically sewing a giant rectangle. So I start usually at one corner here, just beneath one of the O-rings, and I don't sew too close to the O-ring because it can interfere with the foot of your machine. So I start as close as I can get where the foot can still move comfortably, and I sew across the strap piece, and then I leave my needle in the down position and I sew along one of the longer edges, and then I stop when I get close to the second O-ring. And at this point what I usually do is I kind of fold it like this, because I want the place where I stop and rotate and to sew across the O-ring, I want the same amount of distance here. It just makes it look nicer and more even. So then you'll stop here, you sew across again beneath the O-ring, and sew all the way up along the other side. And then I do rotate again and I do a back stitch, but I usually back stitch just one stitch. You can also pull your threads through and tie them. Just do whatever you prefer. I usually just do a back stitch. So I'm going to finish clipping and I'll go sew the strap loop at my machine, and then I'll show you the completed strap when I'm done. So this is what your completed strap should look like. And you'll need to repeat the same steps that we just did with the remaining shoulder strap piece and the other 2 O-rings. Now we're going to work on our O-ring connectors. Now for each strap you'll need 2 mirror image sets of the connector pieces. Now there's a couple of options that I gave in the pattern. Well, there's 2 options. One of them is a turned method. Now this turned method is my preferred method, however it doesn't work for all corks and vinyls. It really only works with the thinner ones. If you're using a thicker cork, for example, black tends to be a little bit sturdier and thicker, you'll want to do the alternate method I provided, which is to glue the connector pieces wrong sides together. I'm going to show you both methods in this video, and then you can choose which method you want to use for your bag. So the first method is the turned method. So you need both connector pieces right sides together. And you are going to start by sewing along the curved edges. So these are your curved edges here. These are your straight edges. You're going to sew along the curved edges only with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to trim and turn. So let me go sew these together first, and then I'll show you the trimming and then the turning. So the two curved edges of this connector have been sewn together, and I trimmed the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. And now I'm going to start at the wider end and start turning it right side out. Don't shove it all inside the connector because you're going to find it really difficult to turn. So I just started, and then I tend to just actually pull it out, and I find it so much easier. And if you have tweezers, tweezers help, or you can use the handle of a paintbrush, a pencil, a wooden spoon, and then I just reach in and I keep pulling it out. It does take a bit more work than just sewing them right sides together, but I really like the finished edges of a turn connector. And then when you're close to being done, it helps to just kind of push it out. Now, natural cork is has like a little bit of a tacky feel, so it is a little bit harder to turn. Okay. Now, if you were using fabric for this, you'd want to press it at this stage, but because I'm using cork, I don't want to press it. So what I just do is I roll the seam allowance, and then I use clips, and it just sort of flattens it before I top stitch. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to my machine, and normally we top stitch with a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, but for this pattern I don't want to do that. I want to top stitch with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because when we're sewing the connector to the bag, then we want to use a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I didn't want to have two lines of top stitching, one over top the other, because the odds of that looking nice is pretty slim. So I'm going to go over and top stitch just along these two curved edges with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, I'm not sure if you can see, but I do have the two lines of top stitching. Now we're going to have to sew the other set because you need a set for each handle. When you're attaching this to the strap, you're going to also need to have them opposite, which I will show you in a minute. I'm going to sew this set as well, and then I'll show you that they need to be opposite. But when you're attaching this to the strap, you're going to need to fold it over about 1 3/4 inches. Just going to, that looks about right. And then for now, just hold it in place with some clips. Okay, so there's one. Now I'm going to go and finish sewing this second set just so that you can see a fully completed strap. Now I have my second connector completed, and I'm going to do the same thing. Pass the narrower end through the O-ring, fold it over 1 3/4 inches. Okay, and then use clips to hold it in place. Now it's really important to note here that your connector, the curves have to go in opposite. So they have to be, again, mirror image when they're attached to the strap, because when they're on the bag, you want them to be curving outwards with the wider part at the bottom. Now, if you're going to use the turn method, like I just showed you, you can pause the video now and go back and complete all of the steps we've done so far so that you can create the second strap for the other main panel of your bag. If you want to do the version of the connector where you're gluing them wrong sides together, you can continue watching and I'll show you that method as well. Okay, so if you want to use the alternate method to create your connector, you're once again going to need a mirror image set of the O-ring connector pieces. What you're going to do this time, though, is you're going to glue them together. So when you're gluing them together, the most important part is how you glue them. I like to use a really thin layer of glue. Don't put it on too thick. And take your time and make sure that you're putting a lot of, like, not a lot of glue, but you're putting glue evenly in a thin layer all the way even to the very edges. I don't want the edges of the connectors to be unglued. It'll just look nicer if they're glued all the way to the very end. Okay. And again, I'm just using Fabri-Tac for this. It's just a fabric glue. Okay, and then place them wrong sides together. Then I'm just going to, while they're drying, put something really heavy on them. Now while this is drying, we need to trim away some of the, along the curved edges of these connectors, because when we're doing the turn method, we're actually removing 3/8 of an inch on either side of the curved edges when we're sewing them together. So because we're doing it a little bit differently, there's two options. You can just trim directly these two pieces 3/8 of an inch on either side. But if you're planning on doing this method a lot, I would actually just remove the 3/8 of an inch directly on the pattern piece and use it as a cutting guide. So just use another ruler. Here we go. And I just would make a mark at 3/8 of an inch along the way, along the curve. Now, the reason why I didn't put this directly on the pattern piece is because I guess I'm trying to encourage to use the turn method if at all possible. I realize that's not always possible, but like I said, that's my preferred method, so it's the method I'm trying to encourage a little bit. But I realize that not all vinyls or corks make that method possible, so this is another option. So now I'm just going to trim away 3/8 of an inch. Don't worry if it's not like perfect, but just try to be as precise as you can. Okay. Okay. So let's assume this is dry. And then now I can just use this as a cutting guide. I like to use a rotary cutter. If you want to, you can just draw this shape and cut away with scissors, whatever you're more comfortable with. I like using a rotary cutter as well because I just find it gives a smoother line. But I realize not everyone is comfortable doing it this way. Okay, now another important step is to seal the edges if you're doing this method. I hope I have, yes I do. I just use a Q-tip to apply this. And again here, if you did a good job gluing, these layers should not come apart. That's why I kind of emphasize doing a good job with the gluing. And then from this step, all you're going to do is exactly like you did for the turned method, and you're going to top stitch here 3/8 of an inch from the side. And then again, attach it to one of your O-rings, fold it over 1 3/4 inches. So from this point on, it's the same steps as I showed you for the turned method. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to get one of our main panels and attach our handle. Okay, so take one of your main panels. I'm using the one that has the zipper pocket installed, and one of your completed handles, or shoulder straps, whatever we want to call it at this point. You're also going to need a fabric pen and a ruler, and you're going to start by measuring 1.5 inches down from these top outer corners here, and make a mark. On both corners. Okay, then you're going to need, you can use either fabric glue or you can use double-sided tape like I am, and use a little bit of tape or glue. It's just to hold your strap in place while we're sewing it down. Cannot have my tape overlap, otherwise I can't take my backing off. And make sure that you're not putting tape where you're going to be sewing. My tape, actually, you can kind of sew through it. It seems to be fine, but I really prefer to just avoid any chance of having an issue. So I just don't put it where I'm going to be sewing. Do the same thing for this one. Okay, and I also use some clips here, just 2 clips. Remove the tape backing. Okay, now flip it over. And you want this top edge here to be lined up with that mark that you made 1.5 inches, and this should be aligned with the edge of your panel. So just put it like this, and you kind of want the O-ring to be centered in this hump, or I'm not sure what, this curved part. Okay, and then do the same for this side. Okay, and use a clip here to hold this edge in place. Okay, now I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm going to sew these in place. So this time you're going to sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So I'm going to use a pencil here to show you. So you start at one of the, I usually start here at the top edge, but start wherever you want. Sew along this curved edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then when you get underneath the O-ring, you're going to stop, keep your needle in the down position, and rotate. Sew across the bottom here. Make sure that when you're doing that, that you're catching the part of the connector that's been folded under, because you want to sew through all of those layers to make sure it's really secure. So sew across, stop, rotate again, and then finish sewing along this curved edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then do the same for this edge as well. I mean this connector. Okay, and I'll go sew this and then I'll show you what it looks like. So I've completed sewing the O-ring connectors to this main panel. And if you like to add rivets to your connectors, now's the time to do that. So I'm just going to add one rivet to the bottom here underneath each O-ring. I'm going to do that off camera though, because I don't like setting rivets on video. I use the hammer method, so it's a little bit too noisy. Now, if you're interested in using piping, now piping is completely optional, so if you're not comfortable using piping, you really don't need to, but if you're interested in learning how, it's actually not that difficult. I know a lot of people are afraid of adding piping. But it's really not that difficult. I have this brand that I always use. I think it's called Rights. Let me see if I have the packaging cover here. This one. And the reason why I like it is because the tape is exactly 3/8 of an inch. So if you follow seam allowance properly, then it usually works out quite nicely. Before you start putting on your piping, you want to make a mark 1/2 inch from those top corners on both sides. And I don't actually pin my piping all the way around and then sew it. What I usually just do is I'll just start it here, and then I go over to the machine and I'll just curve it outwards here at the 1/2 inch mark, and then I just kind of fold it a little bit like this. And you want, all along this edge, you want the raw edge of your piping to follow the edge of your bag. Now, you can pin it or clip it in place and then do it, but sometimes I like to really stretch it a little bit as I'm sewing to make sure that it's not, that it doesn't pucker, that it's nice and taut. When you get to the bottom corner, now usually they use bias tape to make piping, but if you wanted to ease nicely into the corners and lay flat, what I do is I stop sewing just before I get to the corner. And then what I'll do is I'll just clip about 1/4 of an inch into the tape portion of the piping, and then it just turns the corner really nicely. And I have that shown in the diagram. It's step 26. You'll see that I'm showing you that you should clip the tape a little bit just at the corners, and then the piping will sit nice and flat in those corners. So I'm going to go over to my machine. I'm going to baste this in place. So when you're adding the piping in this step, you're just basting it in place. You're not sewing it. And I usually baste it in place with about 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way at the end. Now when you've finished all the way around and you get to the other corner and you get to that 1/2 inch mark, you're going to do exactly the same thing as you did when you started, and you just angle it out. So you kind of fold the tape in on itself a little bit and you angle it outwards at that 1/2 inch mark. So I'll go baste this in place, and then I'll show you what it looks like. So I've started basting it in place, And I just wanted to quickly show you what I meant by cutting into the tape portion of the piping 1/4 inch, and you'll see how it just lays nice and flat along the bottom corner of that main panel. And there you have it. One main panel is complete and ready for final assembly of the exterior. You'll need to now redo all of the steps that we just completed so that you can finish your second main panel. Hopefully you can see clearly the piping where it curves outwards here at the 1/2 inch mark. And like I showed you, I clipped into the tape portion of the piping at the bottom corners just so that it eases into the corners nicely. The next video we will assemble the gusset, side pockets, and then attach the completed gusset to these 2 main panels.